we had a long meeting. We were going to talk about what are we going to say, and there's so many topics to be discussed in climate storytelling, right? So we decided that the best way to get started would to be talk a little bit about the chronology of climate communication, because even though we feel like climate has been a very small part of the larger scale of the world, we've actually been talking about climate for a while, and there's a lot to be said, and there's a lot that's changed over the years, and a lot that we really have kept the same since we started talking about it. So I would love if you guys could start by telling us a little bit about how climate storytelling originated and where we got to where we are today.
Well, thanks so much for everything. This has been a wonderful event. I'm just so thrilled to learn from everybody here and have this conversation. But maybe I'd just dive in. And so something that's pretty interesting is, I like to think as a kind of, someone who works across environmental and media history. A word that keeps coming up today is culture. And, I think about it as, a word that, in its history, originally meant, it was a noun of process. It meant tending to something like crops or animals. You think about agriculture. Culture was the kind of basis, right? There's already an environmental way that, culture kind of has a history to it. So, the first kind of public messaging that people got about climate change was, Theory of Global Warming, published by Seuss and Revell in 1957. By 1958, you already had, televised documentaries about global warming on the Bell System Science series. And, if you watch this today, it's really kind of remarkable because it's like you watch, glaciers calving, ice falling into the water. You get these animations of, a flooded Miami in this kind of gooey architecture. It's pretty interesting. But already you kind of get the sense that how people were talking about climate change at that point in time had commitments to what people were concerned about. There had been a lot of concern about how nuclear weapons were, weapons testing in the United States at the time had, shaped weather patterns, and the United States had been, the government had been putting out this messaging that's like, oh no, nuclear weapons doesn't, make you have June and January was one of the quotes you'd get from one of these films. So people had this attachment to thinking about, nuclear technologies as being these things that, changed the climate, right? It's kind of novel idea. And, you can see that kind of thinking through from the first 20 years of climate communications, through to the early 1980s. People were still kind of stuck in this way of thinking, what is it about industrial technologies that might, switch from, having a regular climate to something like a nuclear winter, this kind of threshold model. Things are going to switch, and then overnight you're going to have this catastrophe. And so we've been talking about this for the better part of 60 years in public, and you can really start to see, from our origins to where we've come, really interesting story in itself to start to say, how do we tell that story differently today, and what does that history tell us about, these deep commitments we have to thinking about something as abstract as a climate?
Yeah, and I think, I'll let Thomas speak to the history because that's his expertise and can go really deep on that. Has been awesome getting to know you over the last few days and learning about everything you're studying. But I think when I think about, your question around storytelling and media and climate, I think it's really important to realize that the stories we tell impact our shared understanding of how the world works, and that is kind of how culture gets created. And so the alarming thing about storytelling and media and climate now is that a lot of the dominant, kind of most groundbreaking, most eye-catching pieces of media around the climate that we all are grounded in are relatively negative and scary. Inconvenient Truth, Day After Tomorrow, even Greta's speech, these things that we all kind of anchor our shared understanding of what is this problem around, are all sort of alarming, and this is scary, and we need to do something or we're all going to be in big trouble. And so I think something I hope we'll get into in this conversation is what are different stories we can tell, and how can we shift the script on that climate narrative a little bit, not to paint over the scary stuff, because obviously there's real consequences to all of this, but something about it isn't clicking, isn't working, isn't creating the change that we all want to see. So I think we need to unpack what is not working and what can we do differently.
Completely. I completely agree. And that transitions us pretty well into the next thing I'd like to ask you guys, which is what effective versus ineffective climate communication really looks like, and how modern media is shaping the way that we communicate, and how we can use modern media to communicate effectively rather than ineffectively to get people interested in the climate crisis and caring about how they can make an impact, but not so terrified that they're scared into inaction like you're talking about with all the alarmist media out there. So I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this.
Oh yeah, could I jump in next?
Yes, please, yeah.
So yeah, just to totally build on that, I completely agree. And again, the history becomes kind of interesting for me here. Films like The Day After Tomorrow, that were really involved with a lot of climate science, helped a lot of people come to understand something like, threshold models for understanding, how climate change is going to impact, different kinds of, catastrophic scenarios. Like, in a lot of ways, you can see that that's a remake of some of these early nuclear winter films from the 1980s, that you've got this like commitment to catastrophe that's in the background of a lot of the messaging. And at a lot of levels, that's not enabling, it's disabling, right? To kind of live with a kind of constant state of anxiety and fear. And I think that An Inconvenient Truth, for instance, such an interesting film to think about, because it built a ton of political will. Like, it was, for commercial documentaries, there's nothing else like it in the history of nonfiction media. And it comes out of this, important moment right after, a global agreement to kind of ban CFCs, and a lot of that had to do with, talking about the hole in the ozone layer as being a hole. Like, they had a kind of catastrophic image for it. They thought that you could do the same thing with climate change by, attaching it to, a polar bear or rising sea levels. And, there's a way that installed a certain way of thinking about climate. And, we're looking back at this, decades later and trying to think, how do we actually get outside that model where we're stuck on, forecasting really dire images? How is that actually, disabling how we think about practice, change, transformation, these kinds of things that we're here to talk about today?
Yeah. I think that a lot of these movies or pieces of media can be described as dystopian, and that generates a lot of fear. And in some ways, it's created a lot of action. It's created a lot of conversation. But a lot of the response to that has been to try and tell utopian stories about a perfect world where these problems are solved. But a word that I learned recently that I'm trying to use more and more is protopian, which is this notion of it's not a perfect world, but it's just a little bit better than the one we have now. Yeah, and it feels like super action-oriented, which is nice. I think that the realm of speculative fiction has done a great job in helping tell protopian stories. Authors like Kim Stanley Robinson and his book Ministry for the Future, I think, is a really great example, if y'all haven't read it, of he tells the story of basically what the next 20 or 30 years would look like and how we actually go about solving climate change. And there's some hard things in that book. In fact, you might read the first chapter and be like, why did this guy tell me to read that book? Because it's pretty scary. There's a really deadly heat wave to open the book. But then it gets into incremental positive changes, steps in the right direction, and it feels very oh, we can do this, And I think that type of story really helps. Talking about speculative fiction, have to mention the GOAT, Octavia Butler, who has been, really contributing amazing fiction who contributed so many amazing stories to the genre about what the near-term future could look like. So I think that these types of fictional stories are starting to be told. You also mentioned new media, and I think that just something I've learned in my work on social media, trying to explain this stuff and kind of spread good ideas, at least that's what I'm trying to do, is that people, I think of it just really quickly to break it down in terms of 3 levels of what good climate content could be. Step one is like explain the problem. I think we're really good at that now. If you go onto TikTok or Instagram, like there's a lot of people talking about problems and like riling people up, and it gets kind of, you know, scary, but it's very shareable. I think it's even better if you do step two, which is like pair it with a solution. So like, for example, I talk a lot about the financial industry and how if you bank with one of the large banks, your money that's in a checking account is going into a system that is lending a lot of money to the fossil fuel industry. And so, like, that's bad. That might make you a little angry, but here's a way to find a better bank, right? Like, here's a website you can go to make it really easy. I think that type of, like, problem solution combo is really effective on social media. And then the third thing that is just, like, kind of gold standard, I have trouble doing this, but maybe y'all can figure it out, is how do you actually, like, help people feel what it would feel like to be in a world where it's better and different? Like, how can you access the people's imaginations to get to a point where like they can kind of envision that better future and have an emotional connection to it? And that I think that's what, you know, where social media sometimes has its limits, and you need to get into film and novels and sci-fi, and that's why I love those fiction genres. But dare to dream. Maybe we can do it on Instagram too.
Yeah, I love it. I just recently read Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower.
Nice.
And it's work like that is so incredibly important, like telling the stories of what a future would look like with how things are going now. What does the future look like that we actually want to see? And what does the future look like that we really don't want to see? And I completely agree that getting viewers to feel the way that a sustainable future would make them feel is such an incredible motivator to push people for climate action, because hope is a lot stronger of a catalyst than just debilitating fear, and that's something that I think we have a hard time communicating on social media. I mean, I do it myself as someone for Commons and for EcoTalk. We create a lot of media that we have to really walk that line between, are we scaring people and not giving them a solution? Are we making light of an issue? How do we communicate these issues clearly and accurately in a kind of a short form? You can't fit too much nuance into an Instagram post type of format. So I wanted to finish out our conversation talking about that, talking about social media and modern media. There are a lot of echo chambers online. That's a problem that we see. We also see there's a lack of nuance that you can find on social media. And social media can be both a great tool for climate action and kind of a weapon against us in a lot of ways, as we were talking about earlier with the overconsumption that is popularized through socials. So I wanted to ask you guys how you feel we can best break out of these echo chambers and use social media to create positive climate rhetoric and as a tool for good, rather than as a very, very scary alternative to like positive, hopeful collective climate movements.
Well, I can jump in. So, you know, something that I've been thinking a lot about recently is, you know, like one of the films that I end up teaching pretty frequently is this. It's a web documentary that was made by Zacharias Kunuk. He's a Inuit filmmaker who, you know, made a film about indigenous knowledge and climate change in the Arctic. And, you know, part of what's interesting about this story is, you know, it's a film that's designed to sort of take, you know, Inuit elder knowledge, sort of the ways that, you know, global warming's been recorded and these material changes that, you know, they've seen in their lives, and, you know, communicate that to Southerners, right? People who run fossil fuel intensive, you know, and, you know, societies based on these histories of imperialism and dispossession that, you know, that we know these histories, right? But, you know, what happened was Canuck took this film to, in 2009 to Copenhagen, to COP15, and, you know, the climate scientists there were, you know, really argumentative about it, saying that, you know, like taking issue with how Inuit elders were talking about global warming. And what this really highlights for me is that you can't always, you know, think that, you know, putting the right information out there, right, like having, you know, a platform for everyone to tell their story is always going to reach, you know, ears who want to hear the story told in that way. And it's a really complicated thing because, like with the internet, we've given everyone more and more access to tell stories, and that's incredibly important. But there needs to be all that work on the cultural side too, right? About opening, conversations, having dialogue, and sort of building platforms for conversation. One of the places I've really come back to, in making, new media, digital media, something that's, a big part of thinking through climate has been, to talk about everyday use of digital devices. Something that's increasingly interesting to me is, how ICTs have become in themselves an environmental crisis. The amount of electricity that's needed to actually stream and, use devices is something we need to be consciously thinking about. One of the studies I saw recently is, streaming video on a device for 5 hours a day is an equivalent of burning a kilogram of coal. And, that's something to, kind of think through. But I've also, seen, people who are working on this material with commitments to climate justice, who are, Laura Marks is a scholar at Simon Fraser University in Canada. She's developed this culture around, small file film festivals where people, use compressed media, short form media, things that are, low carbon intensive, low energy cost media as a kind of practice that develops around our digital culture, right? Thinking scarcity, thinking, regeneration through your everyday digital interactions is a way that this is kind of turning, thinking about what digital culture can actually look like, with a low energy, low carbon footprint, so.
That's really cool. I want to go to that festival.
Yeah.
It's like Degrowth Film Festival.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Sorry. To speak to your point about echo chambers real quickly, because I think that's super important, especially for, a community of people interested in sustainability. I think that the sustainability framing is sort of an echo chamber in itself, and we need to break out of that to reach more people. This notion of like, we need to reduce our consumption to save the planet really resonates with a lot of people. We're all here because it means something to us, but it just isn't gonna hit a large part of the population. And I think we spend a lot of time just talking to each other. So what are other lenses we can view climate through? And how do we access new audiences through those lenses? So I talk about economics a lot and finance. That seems to have kind of interested a new group of people. I think that it's also really helpful to just think about what are the good parts of this, right? Like, it's not just that we need to do it because we feel guilty and we want to save the planet, but like there's a lot of really awesome things that we can change about our society if we pull this off. Can we talk about those more? Like cleaner air, cleaner water, shorter work week, hopefully, like more free time, more walkable cities, better transportation, like just all of these things that actually make our lives better are ways in, I think, to accessing other people than just saying, we need to use less stuff. And yeah, I think I was just thinking about how like Rivian's a good example of this actually. Like, they're cool cars. It's not just that they're EVs and they don't use gas. It's like, this is cool. I'm looking at it like, it's kind of whoa, this is actually different. I think that, the last point I'll make on that is that having some sort of model for it where we're actually putting these values on a pedestal and making them, not guilt associated, but sort of like making it the future and pulling people along towards that positive vision is a way to access new folks. And I think the political pieces of it can be a little bit scary. But one point I want to make about echo chambers that I think is important for folks to think about too is that this conversation is often associated with liberal people and the left. I'm not saying that everyone here is on that side of the spectrum, but my guess is most of us are. But when we're talking about climate change as a systemic issue, we've heard a lot of conversations today about extractive economics and profit-seeking industries and like, this type of profit and consumer-oriented society that we're kind of trying to fix or change. And it's very actually similar to the enemy that people talk about when you're in conservative, especially like these alt-right conversations about the deep state and like the establishment and the cabal of people who are running the world from Davos. There are people who are like the system, people who are the establishment that are benefiting the most from the economy we have now that is creating all this pollution and climate change. So we kind of all have the same thing we're fighting against. And I think it's important to recognize that and approach conversations a little bit differently. Like folks on that side of the spectrum, probably not gonna engage with sustainability, right? But like talk about the people who are kind of benefiting from all this and how they're holding us back from, more localized power, more decentralized power, more power back to the people, back to the communities, then you're having a real conversation. So I think that's one area to find common ground on the political side that I'm excited about right now.
Thank you guys so much. If you want to see more of their work, you can find them both online and read the incredible things Thomas writes and the incredible videos Michael makes. Thank you both. And I want to welcome to the stage Deandra and our other Michael Washington, for our next half of this storytelling panel.